Thank you, Nate, for that lovely warm welcome.
For millennia, ocean currents have turned in massive rotating circles. They're called gyres, and they're caused by winds and the Earth's rotation. Our North Atlantic gyre, as many of you know, brings waters to Ireland that the hardy swim in all year round, and weather that never stays still. Yeats opened The Second Coming with these words: "Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, a blood-dimmed tide is loosed. The ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." This is how the worst of passionate intensity sounded a few days ago. Tuesday will be power plant day and bridge day, all wrapped up in one in Iran. There will be nothing like it, exclamation point, exclamation point. Open the fucking strait, you crazy bastards, or you'll be living in hell. Just watch. Praise be to Allah. On April 7th, 2 days later, Trump followed with, "A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. I don't want that to happen, but it probably will." When the President of the United States profanely threatens to commit genocide, the ceremony of innocence is over. Will there be a second coming for human rights? Will it fulfill Yeats' fears that a rough beast, its hour come round at last, is slouching towards Bethlehem to be born, destroying all before it? Or will we emerge from this blood-dimmed tide to birth a new chapter for human rights, with all the energy and the vision that this crisis and our world requires? So yesterday, I completed my term as the leader of Amnesty International in the USA, and I'm really honored to be with you to reflect on that question. This last year in the United States was not the start of something. The darkness has been dropping again, as Yeats said, for more than 20 years. 2005 was the last year when global civil and political and democratic rights expanded. Since then, authoritarian populists and their billionaire bromancers have been having a heyday, making few apologies for power grabs, demonizing vulnerable populations, and increasingly winning elections by doing so. Meanwhile, over these 2 decades, the liberal order that assumed the relevance of human rights and the global institutions that defend them did not really understand the existential risk to their power, at least in the United States. In 2007, as civic space was starting to shrink and democratic freedoms were contracting around the world, I returned to the USA from Afghanistan to defend and advance a rights-based version of internationalism. As the proverbial frog boiled over the next decade, I did not see what was happening to the human rights system until the shock of 2016, when Donald Trump made a mockery of the mockery that so many liberal elites and institutions had made of him. But it wasn't really until last year that I came to view what was happening to human rights work as catastrophic. The the anti-rights team in the second Trump administration, and the copycats now metastasizing in other countries and in US states, are going after the 2 fundamental pillars of the human rights community. First, that no one is above the law, and second, that human rights belong to everyone. Those are the 2 pillars on which human rights rest, and they are in tatters. When Trump asked what international law constrains his authority, he said the only constraint he faces is, quote, his own morality, unquote, and his own mind. The rule of law has become a naive innocence for him. His key advisor, Stephen Miller, famously described international rule of law as a nicety, because in the, quote, real world, unquote, as he understands it, only strength, force, and power rule. That second golden rule, that human rights belong to everyone, has had a modern and crucial awakening from identity blindness to consciousness, from non-discrimination to anti-discrimination. Today's human rights workers know we can't meaningfully advance human rights for everyone if we're not honest about how identity-based power and bias shape law, institutions, and resource allocation. That is the bedrock of human rights work, certainly as I've experienced it. It emerged from movement work in the United States, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, Black Lives Matter, migrant rights, and the fight for Palestinian rights, amongst others. At the Munich Security Conference earlier this year, the USA's chief diplomat, Marco Rubio, framed the journey to create diverse and inclusive societies as, quote, civilizational erasure, unquote. In a speech from the 19th century, he told Europeans their colonialism was a civilizing force, and for that they gave him a standing ovation. He did with identity bias what Stephen Miller did with force. He didn't just make discrimination acceptable, he made it the secret sauce of US power. In his United States, there will always be a European Judeo-Christian nationality, which lines up well with Miller's claim a couple of weeks ago that he does actually believe in human rights, but only for ordinary citizens and not for savages. These two attacks, authoritarian mockery of the rule of law on one hand and the assault on human rights for all on the other, has put human rights defenders and millions of already vulnerable populations in harm's way and is laying waste to the human rights system itself. And there is simply no going back to what we once had. So that's the 30,000-foot view of what has happened to human rights in this era. Before I turn to the question of what is to be done, I want to lift up two specific human rights realities that I've worked on these past 5 years, one foreign policy focused and the other domestic. On my first day on the job as executive director in 2021, I asked the board chair what was coming down the pipe that he wanted my attention to. And he said, well, your first task will be to launch a report finding that the government of Israel is committing apartheid in both Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territories. Amnesty's research revealed how Israel had systematically engaged in discrimination, dispossession of land, killings, and other forms of repression based on a racial hierarchy. In my first months, actually my first weeks, I met with the Biden administration and a lot of members of Congress to explain our research. That went so well that 25 Jewish Democratic members of Congress wrote a public letter condemning me, and there was a campaign to have me fired and Amnesty censured. As interesting a first year as that was, it was nothing to what followed. 1 month after President Trump was elected a second time, Amnesty released a 280-page report documenting the ongoing genocide in Gaza. For some, we reached those conclusions later than we should, but we did it with depth. We believe that genocide is still ongoing today. The effort to defend Palestinian human rights has transformed not just the human rights world, but the non-profit sector and life and speech on college campuses across the United States, and drawn new lines and divisions on both the far left and the far right in the USA. If page 1 of Trump's playbook was to strike multiple human rights protections in vulnerable communities with what Steve Bannon once called muzzle velocity, page 2 was a very strategically targeting specific cases that would have a powerful signaling effect for others. Take, for example, a case that we worked on, Mahmoud Khalil's case. He was a Columbia student protester. He was a green card holder, and he was an activist detained and threatened with deportation. By targeting Mahmoud, Trump signaled every university that it wasn't going to tolerate peaceful protests against their agenda. It sent a message to every green card holder that they were there by invitation and could be deported for speech acts. And it chilled students on campuses across the United States to be fearful of engaging in pro-Palestinian rights activism. And I felt and experienced that on countless campuses. That's why we fought so hard for Mahmoud's release and celebrated with him. And when Leka Cordia, who was the last detainee related to the Columbia protest, was released, we celebrated hers too. I believe that those human rights attacks on those who defend rights in Gaza and on those who spoke about the genocide laid the foundation for what is happening today in the Middle East and reveals the moral corruption of Trump's foreign policy, not just to human rights activists, but to governments around the world. On the domestic rights front in the USA, the issue that has occupied me most was the mass deportation machine and the fear, racism, and increased militarization that has driven it. During the Biden years, we spent a lot of time trying to shut down corporate-run detention centers that were being used to detain asylum seekers. And we got very close by 2024. We'd emptied out, many activists working together had emptied out some of these detention centers, but they were still open when the Trump administration took over. And you won't be surprised to hear that today they are overcrowded with those who came seeking sanctuary. I will never forget meeting asylum seekers in Matamoros, Mexico, which is just across the border from Brownsville. Mainly women, but not exclusively, who'd come, often with young kids, from Haiti, from Venezuela, from different parts of Africa. Many of them had come to Brazil, and they had walked their way north across the Darien Gap to wait at the border south of Brownsville for what the Biden administration had offered them, which was an application through their phones where they would be allowed to get registered for asylum. They waited and waited. Biden lost. And when that happened, they were all turned away. Their hopes of sanctuary shattered. A few weeks ago, I went to a Florida detention center right beside Alligator Alcatraz, where people had been moved. I talked to people who had been detained there for misdemeanors. They were being held there, and they had been held in Alligator Alcatraz without healthcare, without basic sanitation. A couple told us how they had been tortured while they were waiting for deportation or release. This last year has been so devastating in human rights terms that Amnesty released what we called a 12-alarm report on press freedom, on attacks on speech, on loss of protest space in universities, on attacks on judges, forced disappearances, rising militarization, attacks on marginalized groups like the trans community, a free-for-all corporate power grab, particularly in the tech space, and the destruction of international law. When USA Today, it's a newspaper over there, asked the Trump administration to respond to an op-ed I wrote about the report, they said I had Trump derangement syndrome and would ignore it. The gyre has been widening from Darfur to Donbass, across Syria and the entire Sahel, in country after country around the world, with a blood-dimmed tide being driven by growing conflicts, climate catastrophes, and extreme inequality. I keep asking myself, is this the end of human rights work as we know it? Or is there a second coming, being vexed to consciousness that will shape a more just world? For human rights activists to make that happen now, 3 things will have to occur. Our theory of change is going to have to evolve. We're going to have to be more relevant to emerging forms of activism. And we need to start working on the next human rights blueprint now. I want to briefly unpack each of those, and then I'll be done. For most of Amnesty's history, and certainly when I took up this role, we had a simple theory of change. We presented policymakers with evidence of their human rights, of the human rights consequences of their actions, and we made their legal obligations clear. When we did that effectively, we could be relevant to those who were in harm's way. And if, as happened often during the Biden administration, policymakers ignored their human rights obligations, then we'd bring public pressure to bear until they listened. That's what we did when Obama ignored our findings on extrajudicial killings, or when Biden sent bombs to Israel that were dropped on Gazan families, or when he fist-bumped Mohammed bin Salman after MBS had murdered the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But that was then. Now we have an administration supported by Congress that explicitly rejects the validity of hard evidence, considers legal obligations to be a nuisance tactic of a captured liberal bureaucracy, and increasingly deems those who bring public pressure for human rights protection to be so anti-American that they should be investigated as supporters of terrorism. So what do? We evolve our theory of change. We still need cutting-edge research. We still need hard evidence. That's why we had research teams in detention centers, on the border and in sanctuary cities and on the ground in Gaza. We still have Amnesty colleagues in Venezuela and 70 other countries around the world, many of them documenting the human rights impact of the Trump administration and other authoritarian practitioners in their countries. And we've had tech teams analysing the terrifying confluence of artificial intelligence and weaponry and its use in surveillance and the shutting down of legitimate protests. But the reason that we do this research and the way that we present it and who we try to reach with it is changing. If we want to alter this administration's calculus on human rights, we have to increase the political costs of denying human rights. And to do that, we have to speak differently and we have to reach new audiences. Being too legalistic or targeting those who already agree with us isn't just a pathway to irrelevance, it's a massive opportunity cost in the middle of an existential crisis for our institutions and the communities that rely on us. So this takes me to my second provocation. I believe we have to evolve the ways in which we support human rights activists and activism. In recent months and weeks, I spent time in Minnesota talking to people who saw their neighbors kidnapped from cars and schools, afraid to shop for their food or go to work. And those folks who might not have felt that they knew a lot about human rights said, I know that isn't right. They saw men in masks and body armor making warrantless arrests, and they knew it wasn't right. They saw Renee Good and Alex Preddy being killed, and then they heard their government lying about those killings. And instead of staying home as they were instructed after the killings, they signed up for rights trainings in their thousands. They said, enough. It isn't human and it isn't right. They were changed utterly, as Yeats might have said, and not just in Minnesota. From LA to New York, from Portland, Oregon to Boston, there is an emerging form of human rights activism. It is decentralized, low-tech, it changes tactics from city to city. In some places it uses whistles and phone cameras to monitor the movements of ICE. In other places it gets city ordinances to limit the use of public spaces for anti-immigrant attacks. It has migrated from websites that geolocate unwarranted kidnappings to signal groups to going offline entirely in block-to-block word-of-mouth communications to provide mutual aid to protect and connect communities. Sometimes it's just organized to get food and drug prescriptions to neighbors' homes. Other times it's more explicitly training people in peaceful, non-cooperative resistance. But it is always designed to do three things to anti-rights attacks: slow them down, make them more publicly toxic, and bring more people to the struggle. These groups have drawn deep lessons from past rights movements and their theories of change, and it's working. At the other end of the human rights risk spectrum, another form of activism is also emerging in the United States. Not to say that it happened there first. Earlier this month, or actually it was last month, No Kings saw more than 8 million people take to the streets in protests. This wasn't life-on-the-line activism, but it may turn out to be just as important. If you look internationally at how authoritarian regimes and even dictatorships are ended from within, research shows that time and again, it only takes about 3.5% of a population to engage in active participation in non-violent movements to succeed. This has happened time after time. Those kinds of numbers become too large to repress. It's about 12 million people in the United States. They become broad enough to trigger defections from elites and from security apparatus. And inevitably, they become more and more socially and economically diverse, which is deeply frightening to a government that seeks to tier the human rights of groups based on their identity. The more diverse and inclusive a movement it becomes, the harder it is to isolate and target particular identities without political consequences. No Kings, just a few weeks ago, organized more than 3,000 different marches, both in the United States and all around the world. It was an awakening. So how do activists engage with this fast-moving river of resistance? How do we show up in that river? And to borrow from and butcher a Glennon Doyle metaphor that I love, I think of this pro-rights movement not as a ship, but as a flotilla of smaller boats. Amnesty is not a captain on any of those boats. We have remarkable activists fighting against ICE in some boats, confronting racial injustice and white supremacy in others, more boats mobilizing to end the Gaza genocide, demand an end to gun violence, stop the onslaught against reproductive freedoms, fight for LGBTQIA+ rights, women's rights, indigenous rights, and confront a warped, misogynist, and proto-fascist story of Christian nationalism that bears no resemblance to the preachings of Christ or Muhammad or Buddha or Martin Luther King. And in these past days, we are seeing more new boats with more activists joining to stop the killings of civilians across the Middle East after the United States and Israel began an illegal war that must end. That human rights flotilla does not need to become one big ship. It doesn't need one captain, but it does need to find common cause and a better offer so that more join. When we sail close together, we often call from boat to convince people already in the movement to join our boat's efforts, or sometimes to question theirs. We can harshly judge those not already in a boat, or use language with each other that isn't welcoming of those who are considering coming off the shorelines. That's not what we have time for right now. When we sail close together, we need to raise our collective voices to reach the shorelines where so many people are still watching and waiting to decide if they want to fight for human rights. Whether they're in historically impacted communities that are unconvinced of our relevance to their struggle, or even from communities that haven't even engaged on human rights, but they know that it's wrong for armed mass men to pull a child from her parents, a worker from their car, or a brave Palestinian rights activist from their school. And when they listen to us, they cannot only hear our anger and our pain. Who joins a party because people were angry that they hadn't? We need to celebrate in our flotilla what is most powerful in human rights work, the light and energy and power within us that sees every person everywhere as a holder of rights that deserve our attention, respect, and dare I say love. One moment that brought this home to me personally was in late June of last year. My friend David Vig, he is the leader of Amnesty Hungary. He'd just been indicted by the Orbán regime for organizing the Pride March in Budapest. He'd done this every year. In 24, the largest march he'd ever organized was 10,000 people. And the Orbán regime said, you organize a march this year, 25, and we're going to put you in jail and we're going to shut down Amnesty. So David, being David, called a bunch of us up and said, hey, they're going to put me in jail and shut me down. How about marching with me? So we went. A lot of us went. And we thought, okay, that's great. There's going to be 10,000 and a few hundred from Amnesty. There were 200,000 people on the streets of Budapest joining what was 10 times larger than the largest ever Pride March. And what I believe began, or at least took a big step forward that day, was a realization amongst Hungarians that the days of Orbán were done. And of course, we all celebrated what happened just a few days ago. I remember one particular moment as we were going down the street in Buda, and I said to David, so we're dancing and we're chanting about Orbán. Is this a party or is it a protest? And David looked at me and smiled and said, yes. It is that realization that we need to create an invitation that more people see the joy in is going to be powerfully important. And what is happening in places like Hungary are not just happening there. People-powered rights movements are growing all over the world. In the USA, Amnesty has never had more people take action with us. More than 1 million people in the last year. Every week, thousands more are joining our cause. We don't accept government or corporate funding, so we rely on ordinary Americans to invest their precious resources in us. And we are set up to fight as an internationally networked, decentralized, and people-powered movement. And we have one of our great sections here, headquartered in Dublin, fighting alongside others as Amnesty Ireland. I believe this month will ultimately prove a turning point for human rights work. It's not just the end of Orbán and all that signals. It's not just the growing anti-war movement around the world. It's not just the worst of Trump's passionate intensity has revealed his baseness even to his own base. People like Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, and the like, who find themselves agreeing with the Pope that what Trump is saying and doing is wrong. We're moving into a new kind of political reality in the USA. People are waking up. And if Trump doesn't steal the midterms, his power to do harm will be more diminished in November, I believe. One last provocation for you. If this political sea change is to seed a new human rights dawn, we cannot go back to some flawed historical moment when the United States wrote new rules as a global hegemon after the Second World War. And we cannot wait for a rough beast to slouch through the ashes of destroyed institutions and communities. The second coming of international law and human rights work needs to begin now. It needs activist organizations like Amnesty to do the research, propose new institutions and policies for a more even political and economic playing field, and to build a pro-rights political constituency willing to fight for that future. It needs state actors like Ireland to work with others to take principled stands, as it did in the Gaza genocide case before the International Court of Justice. And it needs academics and students at universities like this great institution to be debating and proposing and thinking about what comes next and how to make it work. So this is the last time I'm going to be able to represent the remarkable organization that is Amnesty International in an official capacity. Yesterday was my last day. I am so grateful to be here and to UCD for all that it's done in my life. Perhaps most of all for the lifelong friendships that I began while here. Some of you are here today. Thanks for being here. But also because this university gave me a second chance when I needed it as a young man, so that I could learn what it was like to be a real student and to imagine what a purposeful life could be. Yeah, for giving me a chance to live that life. Thank you very much. I'm so grateful for this time with you today. Thank you.